Hi, Nikolas Schreck. Thank you so much for coming on the show for your fourth, but technically fifth time. As some of our listeners and viewers on YouTube may have noticed that we kind of did this episode already, but due to some technical gremlins, we're being forced to re-record it. So I appreciate your patience, Nick, and thank you so much for giving us some more of your time.
My pleasure. Everything in the supposedly super convenient dystopian digital world never works properly, so I'm happy to accommodate. Anyway, that's our cover story. We know that we revealed too much secret knowledge in that episode for it to ever be heard by mere mortals. That's the so
we got the secret chiefs came and told us that we had to take the episode down, and we're just abiding by their by their rules. So I think today.
Well, the second time we'll do it even better.
Yeah, there you go. Second time's the charm in this case, hopefully. So the kind of what we were talking about last time, what we'll talk about again today is kind of we've spoken about the kind of concept of Satan before, and we've spoken to a degree about some of the characters involved with Satanism in the past, and on this episode, I'd like to talk a bit about the kind of practices of some of the groups, and also look at some of the groups we haven't actually discussed before, like Order of Nine Angles. We've never really spoken about them before. But I think a good touchstone was I think I'd said in previous dialogues that I thought the Church of Satan was probably the first kind of outwardly successful, I'll put that in quotes, group. But prior to the Church of Satan, there were other groups that existed and referred to themselves as Satanists in secret. So maybe we could talk a little bit about those prior groups, or some examples at least of some prior to the Church of Satan groups. You mentioned a French group before.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you believe that largely because the only thing LaVey was really successful at, and it wasn't really a group, was marketing the idea that the Church of Satan was the first everything. It was a publicity vehicle. The Church of Satan was a publicity vehicle for one person. And I've talked about him and his character flaws ad nauseum, so we don't have to get too much into that. But, it's necessary to understand the nature of the Church of Satan. You have to see it as the personal vehicle for publicity of one particular person. So in the same way that he said the Church of Satan is the best-selling book since the Bible, it's hyperbole and nonsense to say it was the first satanic group. By the very nature of Satanism, it was usually forbidden and taboo. So therefore, most genuine satanic groups were hidden and genuinely secret. They were never very powerful, unlike the fantasies of Christians and satanic fanatics alike. They were never they never had any kind of real authority. They were small, fragmentary groups. You mentioned in our previous interview the novel La Basse by Georges Huysmans. And and I cover this in my book, The Satanic Screen, there was always a very strong streak of French Satanism. And it's a kind of Satanism which when I was a devil worshiper, which I encountered in my travels in the Catholic world particularly. So going way back to the 1890s and even to Madame Montespan, the mistress of the French king, the Black Mass, the traditional celebration of Satanism as a blasphemous rite against Catholicism was very prevalent in the Catholic countries, in Italy, in France, wherever, in Central America, wherever Spanish colonies were formed and the Catholic Church was instituted. There was always a reactionary kind of Satanism that turned the Catholic Church upside down and blasphemed it. And that tradition has always been going on. That is not what the Church of Satan was about. The Church of Satan was an atheist, publicity vehicle that use the name Satan in not a sincere and genuine way. So when I speak of Satanism, I'm only referring to the genuine devotion or worship of Satan as a metaphysical being.
Have you come across the
And of
term?
course, I've gone.
I was going to say, have you come across the term traditional Satanism before? Because that's one that seems to pop up a lot when you look at these different
Yeah,
groups.
but what? Yeah, the problem with the phrase traditional Satanism, it implies that atheistic uh, pop culture Satanism is any kind of Satanism at all. As far as and this is something we'll get into in general, the importance of etymology in magic, of using words precisely. In the beginning was the word. So calling the kind of LaVeyan nonsense that was practiced Satanism is by its very nature ridiculous and illogical. If it does not accept the existence of the being Satan as a genuine metaphysical being, then that's just his private fantasy. It has no connection. So I think traditional Satanism implies that there is some other kind. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of a weird mutation based on the idea that this bizarre Ayn Randian atheistic symbolic Satanism is any kind of Satanist. It would be like saying I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe in God. Unlike the traditional Christians, it doesn't make sense. It's kind of a sign of the decadence of our age metaphysically that one would even. I mean, it's like New Age. Let's get out of the realm of Satanism and occultism. In the New Age movement, people mishmash Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, astrology, the Kabbalah all into one big mess, and then they refer to the traditional spiritual traditions. But that's dignifying the New Age as if it makes any sense at all. So, I am very much a purist. So I would say saying traditional Satanism implies that this sort of alternative atheism that calls itself Satanism, like the Temple of Satan, the Church of Satan, and many others, that is even valid at all, if you see my point.
Yeah, I know that the ONA, Order of Nine Angles, use the term to imply that I think that their kind of law, at least, we'll get into them a bit later, but this is kind of relevant, I suppose. That their kind of law is that their leader Anton Long, which is a name we can possibly discuss because of the first name at least, anyway. But Anton Long apparently received some kind of traditional, folk Satanism in England somewhere, and blah blah blah. It's as all of these occult orders have to have. They have
Yeah,
to have their kind of
well,
mystical, their sort of secret teacher has to teach
yeah,
someone, don't they?
I was gonna get into that. The Rosicrucians began this. The Rosicrucian movement was an entirely fictional literary invention that talked about ancient antecedents and its traditional lineage. And this is, we have to start debunking these myths of the founding myths of these occult orders. The Order of the Golden Dawn based its foundation on a largely fictional basis. Crowley
Fraulein
and
Alice Pringle, isn't
Aiwass,
it?
as far as
Yeah. I think
yeah,
there's a really
yeah,
good
exactly.
there's a good essay by I've forgotten the name. He's been a guest on our show a couple of times. Older guy, I can't remember his name now. I'll flash it up on the screen. But he's written a really good article to sort of disproving the Fraulein Sprengel myth, I suppose, of the Golden Dawn. It's excellent. What's his name? Not Gregory Sam. It's another guy. That's going to bug me. Anyway, I'll flash it up on the screen. But and I'll link the thing.
Yeah, well, I think maybe for some of your listeners that may not be as engaged with the history of Western occultism, one point that I think is very important to make. I mean, and I may want to make it clear for those who don't understand that I have completely renounced any value to Western occultism. I've completely broken with it many years ago through this entire century and at the end of the 90s. So one of the major of many problems with Western occultism as a valid system of initiation is this fictional, even the Freemasons did it. The Freemasons claim that they have this ancient Egyptian pedigree. And I think that's what inspired all of these fictional lineages in other occult groups. The Order of the Golden Dawn in 19th century London claimed that it was based on an earlier German group, as you mentioned, this Fräulein Sprengel, Order of the Purple Dawn. That was its, it's always looking back to some undiscoverable, obscure group that was the beginning of it. But the Freemasons did it in claiming falsely that they have an ancient Egyptian lineage, which actual history shows is absolutely not true. The Rosicrucians claimed to be an ancient order, and we know that's absolute fiction. Madame Blavatsky claimed to have encountered spiritual masters, secret chiefs, false Tibetan traditions and lineages, which if anyone knows anything about Tibetan Buddhism, you can immediately look at and see it's nonsense. Gurdjieff cryptically referred to his secret masters who can't really be named, information that he received from secret societies. Crowley basically stealing most of the Golden Dawn material and Theodore Royce's material from the Ordo Templi Orientis, which Theodore Royce founded in Germany, but claiming that Aiwass, now I'm not doubting that a spiritual being can give you wisdom, but I believe the Book of the Law that Crowley bases his whole religion on is a contrived, half-baked Nietzschean manifesto that he, Aleister Crowley, wrote. And I think there's absolutely no proof that he received it or that it was transmitted by some supernatural being through his wife. That's a whole other issue. I mean, I believe the whole Book of the Law is a bogus creation that he invented after he was in Egypt. And I think that's a problem with the whole Western esoteric tradition, because it isn't a real tradition. It has a kind of identity crisis, and it always has to look for some fictional source of authority, as it's referred to in religious study groups.
Mm. Yeah, it's like a lineage obsession, isn't it?
Right. I mean, the true spiritual traditions, there is no doubt who they came from, where they came from. It is passed on, over the centuries. The reason that these occult groups have to create fictional lineages is because they're based on fantasy for the most part.
We had David Beth on the show fairly recently, and he seems to be part of this sort of movement away from transcendental Western esotericism into this kind of more old chthonic of the body kind of magic rather than transcendental magic. Have you encountered any of that?
I know of him because this a culture conference happens in Berlin quite frequently, so I've heard the name through there. But I have to tell you, I don't really keep up with current magical and occult streams, and I don't know why I would be interested in anything other than transcendence. I mean, that is the point of spiritual development, as far as I'm concerned. What is one's intention? Why are we doing magical or metaphysical practices? The only reason to be doing them is if they afford actual enlightenment and liberation. If they're not doing that, then they can very often become a sort of flavor of the week escapism and entertainment under spiritual auspices. So, I mean, I can't criticize that idea because I'm not familiar enough with it. Another thing I think we should address, particularly in the United Kingdom, as far as these false lineages, it's what you said about the ONA claiming to have some basis as some, real, in quotes, traditional Satanism lineage. This is the same thing that Gerald Gardner did, and Margaret Mead, and Alex Sanders. The same bullshit about that there was a real Wiccan tradition, which, there's two levels of knowledge. history proves there was no such thing as Wicca, that the word was not used to mean wise ones, that witchcraft, the word was used simply to mean malefic magic. It never had a positive sense in these times that these witchcraft groups idealize. So I think because the English are particularly aware of Sanders and Gardnerian witchcraft and magic, but we know that Gardner was a complete con man who hired the better writer Crowley to come up with a witchcraft journal to ghostwrite it for him and to create a bogus tradition, which Crowley did too. So, I mean, I personally look at all of this as rather pathological and not of any spiritual value. Western occultism seems to me to be a very symptom of the Kali Yuga, of and of what Rene Guénon, who I've referred to before, referred to as counter initiation. I think it's very dangerous. I think it creates very attractive illusionary systems that are usually invented by some narcissistic person who wants to be admired and be the leader of a group, almost like an inverted parody of religion. You know, usually they're breaking with traditional religion, and very often they become even more of a fanatical personality cult than the religions they claim to be rebelling against.
It's interesting. We've mentioned this before, but when I was in the OTO, I got this very strong sense that there was no point past Crowley to them. That Crowley was the kind of stopping point. There, you could write about Crowley and you could, elaborate on Crowley, but you weren't allowed to, add to Crowley. It's what it felt like a lot of the time. It was like that was the stopping point. That was the apex
Right.
of Thelema. Whereas I think that's probably antithetical to what Crowley himself would have been like, because he often did build upon his own, system, and he actually did build upon older ideas. Whereas, I can't imagine Crowley being down with the idea of it just stopping there, not kind of developing or innovating in any sense.
Well, I don't want to get too political about it, but first of all, what is the legitimacy of Grady McMurtry's Ordo Templi Orientis? Does it have any other than a legal? It's kind of ridiculous. A United States court is the ultimate arbiter of whether a metaphysical system is valid or not. That's essentially what it's based on. Why should anyone respect Grady McMurtry's version of the OTO as being particularly the genuine successor to whatever Aleister Crowley had in mind? Kenneth Grant's has just as much merit or none. Both of them, and this is Crowley's divide and conquer way of dealing with people. He did that all his life, to give this person authority and that one authority. This is something that narcissistic people do, is say you're in charge of this and you are too, and then watch them fight.
Yeah,
So
and
when we're talking about,
he's certainly someone that
go ahead.
had a problem holding relationships. Let's put it that way. Like one of the big criticisms I personally have of Crowley is the way he dealt with people, especially people that got a bit too high up the chain, if that makes sense. A bit spiritually speaking, got a bit too close to his own, his own level, I suppose. He would just cut them down.
Yeah, to me, Crowley's personality, and how can we judge a spiritual teacher except through their relationships and how they function as a human being? If they don't do so on a more superior level, if they don't practice what they preach, look at Crowley's marriages were horrible. He abused his wives. His relationship with people like Victor Neuburg or Israel Regardie, who I actually met, and he described the abusive behavior of Crowley, of Wilfred Smith, of so many people that he dealt with. Nobody was ever good enough for him. He dismissed everybody. He dismissed, everyone failed him. Only he was valid, and that's just narcissism. And this is, that's become a very trendy phrase that people throw upon anyone who's an asshole or an unpleasant person. But I would say there's a good case to be made that most of the founders of these modern 19th and 20th century occultists have very strong narcissistic streak. Madame Blavatsky, founders of the Golden Dawn, Crowley, Gurdjieff, and certainly the more modern occult groups absolutely do. It's unvarnished.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but you wanted to get into more than the legitimacy of these groups, which you can argue about all day,
Hmm.
about practice itself and the validity and efficiency and merit of the actual practices that they do.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, LaVey has always struck me as more of a carnival act, kind of, like a theatrical man rather than one with any kind of roots in genuine occultism. But he did sort of try and, well, he and Aquino did try and kind of instill some kind of ritual practice at some point, didn't they?
Yeah, that's a complicated subject. If you want me to explain the chronology
Mhm.
of it for your
Yeah, that'd be great.
viewers, yeah, basically, maybe some people only know Michael Aquino as a notorious child molester, which is basically, if you looked online, that would be all you know about it. Now, I should point out, because that may be all you know, I don't think that those allegations about him are true at all. I've given a very detailed interview about my relationship with Aquino and the Temple of Set to a podcast called Lantern Bridge, so I
Mhm.
won't be too redundant or reiterate. But if, unfortunately, since the first thing people think in this decadent age is usually some idiotic internet rumor, I have to point out I do not believe Michael Aquino was a child molester or involved with anything like that. As I've joked about it, for him to be a child molester, he would have to have had sex, and I think he was an entirely asexual kind of being. So yeah, basically, for those who may not know the saga, in 1968, the film Rosemary's Baby came out, which, as I have made very clear in my book, The Satanic Screen, and elsewhere in other of my works, was essential in sparking the occult revival of the 60s. It really gave a huge impetus to the American and British form of this renaissance in magical thinking and occultism and witchcraft in general. So, as your listeners and viewers may know too, Anton LaVey claimed to have played the devil in Rosemary's Baby. He claimed to have been the technical advisor. And I know from firsthand sources, for instance, Gene Kotowski, who helped Roman Polanski put the film together, and many other sources, that Anton LaVey was never hired as a technical advisor for the film. He did not play the devil. Actually, I explain who played the devil in Rosemary's Baby in my book, The Satanic Screen. Actually, it was a cowboy actor named Clay Tanner. And then they also used a very skinny female dancer to get into this sort of reptilian lizard suit that they created. So, to make a long story short, the only connection LaVey had to the film Rosemary's Baby was that a local San Francisco movie theater hired him as a publicity vehicle, as was very often the practice with 1960s horror films, to create what used to be called a hullabaloo
Mm.
about a film. They hired LaVey, who at that point in 1968 was only known as a local eccentric that had this kind of prank of a group called the Church of Satan in San Francisco. He wasn't really a national figure. He had no writings of his had been published. So they hired him to appear in a hearse at the premiere of Rosemary's Baby in 1968, summer of 68. And a young uh, Vietnam veteran named Michael Aquino, who was in the United States Defense Intelligence Agency, United States Army, came back to his native San Francisco from Vietnam and happened to go to this premiere of Rosemary's Baby. And he encountered Anton LaVey during this publicity vehicle. And I've said before, he basically fell in love with Anton LaVey. Not his ideas, not the Church of Satan, the person himself. A kind of not sexual or romantic love, but a kind of homophiliac obsession with the person of Anton LaVey. So he became involved with the Church of Satan. Anton LaVey was lazy, undisciplined, didn't really have a plan for what to do with the Church of Satan. Michael Aquino was industrious, logical, very much a joiner who very much a part of university and academic protocol. Then he joined the army, where there's even more protocol and rules. So Aquino made an attempt to systemize and organize the chaotic Church of Satan into something like a functional religious group. And he became the editor of the Cloven Hoof, which was the Church of Satan's newsletter. He sort of formalized and defined the nature of this degree system that they borrowed from the basic occult degree system. And he became like his right-hand man. And LaVey sort of moved into the background of just being a figurehead, which is really what he wanted to do, and let Aquino do all the work. And then in 1975, Aquino, who was also clearly, this was a battle between two narcissists who wanted attention. Aquino stated that he was offended that LaVey was granting these degrees, master and priest, etc., in a corrupt way, nepotism, or if somebody did something for LaVey, he would consign them with a degree. So kind of like Martin Luther and the Catholic Church, Aquino broke with the Church of Satan, supposedly because of this corruption. I don't really believe that was the reason, and then he claimed, like Crowley, to have received this spiritual transmission that was called the Book of Coming Forth by Night, which was clearly an imitation of the Book of the Law by Crowley, as Aquino was a big Crowley fanboy. And this transmission, which you can easily find online, I think, basically Aquino claimed that the Egyptian god Set revealed himself to be the true Satan, the name falsely, interestingly. This is also something that Kenneth Grant, the British occultist, claimed, that the name Set was the original name of Satan. Now that is logical and historical, Egyptological, archaeological sense, absolutely not true. There is no connection between the name Set and Satan. Set is in no way even connected to the Hebrew minor spiritual figure character called the Satan. So I need to make that clear. There's absolutely no connection. But Aquino claimed that Set revealed himself to be the Prince of Darkness, narrated this transmitted text to him that revealed that not only was Anton LaVey removed from what Aquino called his infernal mandate, and now the flame had passed on to Aquino, also Set reveals to Aquino that he is the second beast. So he is Crowley's true successor. There's a cryptic phrase, which I'm sure you know, in the Book of the Law, that people have puzzled. What does it mean? Aquino suddenly solved it. It's about him, of course, as any narcissist would think. It's about him and his revelation of being the second beast. Also, certain phrases in the Enochian Keys by John Dee are about Michael Aquino. So this is grandiose, delusional narcissism at its craziest. And so on those terms, he presented this. I don't think Aquino genuinely believed any of this. I think it was a very contrived mechanism to give himself a glorified way to quit the Church of Satan and start his own group.
Mm.
It had nothing to do with any Egyptological authenticity. A lot of it was just Star Wars fantasy and whimsy based on fiction, which is something we can get into, the tendency for occultists to rely on fiction rather than real spiritual tradition as their inspiration. So to answer your question, out of that, yes, the Temple of Set did more actual ritual than the Church of Satan, but still, it wasn't based in any kind of traditional. There is no tradition. So again, a lot of it was made up nonsense that drew on Lovecraft and fictional sources, right? Because there's no there, you know. There is no tradition or lineage to base on. So of course these people sort of have to invent theatrical presentations.
And isn't
Does
there
that answer your question?
what
As far as the difference?
yeah, as far as the differences, I think the Temple of Set, because we had Don Webb on the show a couple of years ago, and I remember him saying that the Temple of Set tended to work around self-initiation rather than there's no kind of there's a grade system, but it's all self-initiation. It's like a trust system almost, but it's not like an in-person thing. I don't know if that was the same, because at one point you were involved with the Temple of Set, weren't you? But
Well, yes. The only, I mean, I should make it clear for people who only are aware of the cartoon version of my career in the spiritual world. I never joined the Church of Satan, even though, according to QAnon and Christians and misinformed Satanists, I was a high-ranking member of it. I was not. I happened to be in love with Anton LaVey's daughter. We got married, and Anton LaVey, shortly after I met him, gave me an honorary membership to the Church of Satan. I never believed in most of the spiritual ideas or lack of ideas of the Church of Satan, and you know, so he gave Anton LaVey gave honorary memberships to other, you know, people in the genre of music that I was in: Boyd Rice, Marilyn Manson, Genesis Peorage, you know, just as a sort of courtesy. Um, it's important to understand, I never joined the Church of Satan. I did make the mistake in 1995 of joining the Temple of Set. And I was a member of it, and I became a priest and a master in it, and I saw its grave flaws. And actually, I have said before, I'm grateful to it, because the Temple of Set was so idiotic. It's what convinced me to give up on Western occultism altogether. Um, so it certainly didn't improve on the Church of Satan. It remained a Church of Satan fan club, and it remained very locked into Anton LaVey's, to me, false pseudo philosophy. And that was one of my many problems with it, along with the nepotism and corruption, which ironically is why Aquino left the Church of Satan. But it was more than malignantly present in the Temple of Set as well. But to address what you were asking about, saying self-initiation is kind of lazy, a euphemism for, if you join the Temple of Set, nobody's, you know, they're supposed to be priests, but they don't help you, they don't teach you, they don't, you know, it's up to you. So basically you get a membership card and a fancy scroll, and good luck to you, because it lazily doesn't want to have a doctrine or a real belief system. And I think that's an issue with many of these modern occult groups.
Yeah, I suppose that's one thing you can say about the OTO, is at least, you know, it's a in-person physical thing, you know, where you interact with other, you know, seekers, I suppose.
Well, yeah, when I became interested in occultism, it had to be in person. You know, you met magicians and you worked with them and you did rituals. These days, when everything has become remote, long distance internet activity, it is almost meaningless. I mean, that obviously encourages and allows for a great deal of fantasy and delusion. And I mean, I think it's very important to say, if you don't have a teacher, and I know the word guru has become almost a derogatory, dirty word. If you don't have a true spiritual teacher and you're leaving everything up to you, you are doomed, because you are going to, your ego is going to guide you to do what you think you need. Only a spiritual teacher who has no vested interests and actually wants your well-being is going to tell you your blind spots and what you need to work on. So the idea of do-it-yourself initiation is no initiation at all.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. The I know the AA, at least, you know, this is anecdotal, but I have a friend that joined the AA not so long ago, and he's never actually met, you know, because it's a master teacher system, isn't it? He's never actually met his master. They've spoken over email a few times, and that's it. And
Right,
I
that's nonsense. I mean,
yeah.
I can only speak from my own experience. When I renounced Western occultism and Satanism and the whole Western esoteric tradition, such as it is, you know, in Tantric Buddhism, the lineage teacher is crucially important. So, of course, Changu Rinpoche, who was my heart guru, taught me in person. There would be no other way to learn. There are specific practices that you have to learn from your teacher. And he learned it from his teacher, who was the 16th Karmapa, who was the reincarnation of many spiritual masters before. So anyone who thinks that you can become truly initiated without a real teacher is deluded, is kidding themselves.
Mm. I suppose one thing we
That's a
didn't.
real a major problem. I mean, you couldn't learn anything without a teacher, but somehow people think in spiritual matters you can just use your instinct, and what will happen then is your ego will guide you into what makes you feel comfortable rather than what you actually need.
Mm. Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't talk about when we previously recorded this interview that I'm interested in, as you know, I've been researching ONA and I've been looking at all these other groups, sort of similar groups to
Hmm.
ONA, and groups that could just be the ONA in you know, in disguise, essentially. Um, why do you feel that Satanism, or at least certain branches of Satanism and fascism or Nazism, sort of work so well together? Why? 'Cause it just seems to pop up all the time. There seems to be this constant, you know, you have like groups like Atomwaffen Division in America that are involved with the Order of Nine Angles, and this Zeus Temple of Zeus thing I found recently. They expound essentially Nazi National Social. In fact, they have direct ties to National Socialism. Like, why in
Right.
particular? Because they, generally speaking, this sort of modern version of the hard right we're seeing, it seems to attach itself to Christianity, not to Satanism. Yet historically, there does seem to be more of a, you know, with the Nazis, they had this thing called positive Christianity, didn't they? Which was a false Christianity, essentially. And
Right. Well, no, I can address that in great detail because I've been personally, well, I mean, for instance, Spencer Sunshine, this Antifa propagandist who I've had some encounters with, has falsely accused me of, in a way, being responsible for Atomwaffen because I was the first person to put James Mason, the founder of the Universal Order and the kind of spiritual guide of Atomwaffen, into the public eye. In my film, Charles Manson Superstar included an interview with him. I used excerpts from James Mason in my 1988 version of the Manson file. And, you know, I used his stuff to show here is an extreme white thinker who has glommed onto Manson and interpreted him. However, what Spencer Sunshine did not mention, and what many others who have followed his propaganda lead, is that I also pointed out that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and other extreme, and the Weathermen, Bernardine Dorn of the Weathermen, the left-wing terrorist groups extolled Manson even more. So my point was that extreme left and extreme right groups have emulated Manson in a way that he didn't agree with, that actually Manson broke with James Mason. He did not approve of the Universal Order ultimately. Even in my own interview with Manson. So a lot of what people understand about this connection is false. I mean, that's an example of it. A lot of it is left-wing propaganda meant to be very simplistic and dualistic, good and evil. And it's not, it's much more complicated than that. Why would fascism, and again, I don't even like to use the word fascism because
Mhm.
fascism, again, this gets back to my emphasis on etymology and correct usage of words. Fascism is the system that Giovanni Gentile and Benito Mussolini devised, particularly for Italy. It was an actual economic system. It was not only, an authoritarian system of repression. Largely, it had a lot to do as an alternative to Marxism. It has many left-wing aspects. Genuine fascism of Benito Mussolini in Italy is not National Socialism. I mean, to bring it in more relevant terms, people who accuse Trump or the MAGA morons of being fascists, that Mussolini would have despised the materialistic and capitalist nature of Trumpism. So these words are very loaded and they mean almost nothing. But to answer your question, why have some of these satanic groups and occult groups been so connected previously to fascism, or at least cartoon-like ideas of fascism and National Socialism? First of all, the pop occult literature, like The Spear of Destiny, The Morning of the Magicians by Powles and Bergier, many, there's a whole bookshelf full of bogus pseudo-occult histories, the occult Reich. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was a particular trend and vogue for books about a purported connection between National Socialism and Satanism and occultism. But it's absolutely not true, first of all. And I've researched this a great deal. The National Socialist regime persecuted Satanists. Actually, Satanists were persecuted and put into concentration camps.
Including members of the OTO as well, yeah.
Absolutely. In many of these occult Nazis believe that Crowley was a kind of crypto-Nazi, which you could certainly find plenty of his writings, which are extolling Hitler to a certain extent, although he eventually turned against him, and his disciple Marta Kunzel tried in a feeble way to interest Hitler in Thelema. But yeah, the OTO were persecuted as a symbol of Weimar Republic sexual decadence and debauchery. The Nazis hated Crowley, and they were aware of him. Benito Mussolini kicked Crowley out of Italy and considered him to be a British spy, which there may be even some grain of truth to that. So, as far as the OTO, which many people claim had some Nazi connection, is absolutely not true. The Fraternitas Saturni of Gregor Gregorius. Gregorius was arrested and persecuted, as were other members of the Fraternitas Saturni, which is the main serious occult group in Germany. After Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland, based on some of his own very mild, sort of new age-ish ideas, Himmler cracked down on occultism, very seriously, even though Himmler himself had antiquarian occult ideas, but they were not incorporated in any major way into the policies of the Third Reich. So I think it's largely because some of these people read this occult literature. There's a book called Satan and Swastika that I remember came out in the 1970s by Francis King. I think that sort of literature created a false idea that there's a link between Satanism and National Socialism. And actually, there's been some evidence that British propaganda tried to encourage that idea during the war, even that the Nazis were Satanists, and so that propaganda kind of leaked into this pseudo history, these occult books, and then I think these satanic and occult groups inspired by them, like the ONA and many others, sort of went with the mythology rather than the truth. But the fact is, National Socialism, after an operation called Action Hess, clamped down on everything: astrologers, tarot card readers, even runologists and Odinists who supported the Nazi regime were persecuted. So I think that's very important to make clear. the reason they're associated, I mean, of course, obviously emulating cruelty and strength and sort of social Darwinist ideas that there could be some sort of connection between some forms of Satanism and a simplistic understanding of National Socialism and fascism in that way. But there is no true historical link. Anton LaVey was responsible for some of this nonsense in satanic rituals. He has this ritual called the Elektrische Vorspiele, which he claimed was, derived from some secret pre-Nazi source, but it's complete fiction. He wrote it and had a German-speaking friend of his translate it into bad German. So, again, like the things we were talking about before with Blavatsky and the secret chiefs, this belief in Nazi occultism is based on just not understanding history. And these people don't want to know. They would rather think that the SS were some kind of secret satanic order than what, in fact, they were clamping down on occultism. Now,
there's
it is true that the ultimate, well, just one final thing, that the ultimate goal of the National Socialist regime, and Hitler privately and Himmler and Bormann spoke about creating a new European religion that would have started to actually become official in 1950 when they thought that they would have won the war. And this sort of, you can see the beginnings of this in Wewelsburg, a sort of neo-pagan, neo-Nordic religion, but it certainly had nothing remotely satanic about it. And even in Mein Kampf and in Himmler's speeches, they used the word satanic in a derogatory sense, even though now another thing, of course, they were somewhat anti-Christian. So that's another thing that Satanists and occultists can glom onto. But their attempt to create a new religion for Europe, and they did want to get rid of Christianity. Even in the Hitler Youth, they were training the young people to get back to northern pagan traditions. But they were very wholesome and would absolutely not be acceptable to Satanists by any means.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just there's also this branch of this thing called esoteric Hitlerism. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before,
Right. Yeah.
which again seems to have links to Satanism.
Yeah, I know a great. I mean, yeah, I know a great deal about it. I knew Matt Cole, who was one of the people who were the successors to George Lincoln Rockwell, and he personally interviewed Savitri Devi, who wrote this book, The Lightning and the Sun, which is very much a kind of Bible of esoteric Hitlerism. The phrase itself was devised by a Chilean diplomat named Miguel Serrano, and esoteric Hitlerism is certainly not anything the human being Adolf Hitler would recognize as being his belief system, but Miguel Serrano sort of idealized and romanticized Hitler and believed him to be an avatar, possibly of Kalki. Miguel Serrano had, a fairly in-depth understanding of Gnosticism. He knew Jung. He was familiar with the figure of Abraxas from Hesse. He met the Dalai Lama. He knew a lot about Tibetan Buddhism. He was in India a great deal. So he certainly was knowledgeable about genuine spiritual traditions. But in no way would Hitler himself have considered himself to be the avatar of Kalki. These are ideas that were very influenced by Savitri Devi in her books, and Miguel Serrano went with them. And Matt Cole, who I knew and had correspondence and spoke to in the 80s, he's passed on since then. He had this group New Order, which was a derivation of the American Nazi Party, that they split over esoteric ideas. He saw Hitler as a religious figure, whereas the American Nazi Party saw him simply as a political ideologue. And some of these ideas you can find trickling into James Mason's concepts of the universal order.
So obviously one of the other groups that have certainly been in the public consciousness a lot more recently is the group I've been looking into quite heavily. which is Order of Nine Angles. You've had some encounters with members, or participants, I should say.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've had encounters and dealings with people in almost every satanic group you can name when I was a devil worshiper, and I still am aware of people who are familiar with or perhaps secretly initiated into the ONA. I have never had the slightest interest or respect for it. I mean, maybe you should describe, since you've been researching it, to the viewers. What are their doctrine and belief and their methods, and then I can sort of critique them. But maybe you could give an overview of them so they know what we're talking about.
Well, they're sort of, I guess, structurally speaking, they don't operate in the same way as a lot of occult orders. There's no pyramidic system, at least according to them. There's no top-down leadership model. It's a do-it-yourself, a bit like we were talking about with the Temple of Set. It's a do-it-yourself kind of system where
Mm-hmm.
it's self-initiation, and you start, the idea being that you start your own cell. Essentially, you build your own Order of Nine Angle, what they call Nexium, or Nexion, I should say. And they seem to be mostly their kind of metaphysical side. They have various paths that you can go down. The sevenfold path is the most famous one, I suppose. And then they have this theory of the causal and the acausal. So this kind of conversation between the earthly realm and this kind of mystical realm. So it does feature some kind of more practical, I suppose, magical side, a more practical magical side to it, I suppose. But also, again, is there's the problem with the way it's set up is it's hard to actually distinguish when they're lying deliberately, very much so, because it's built into a lot of the doctrine, and when they're expounding what they believe to be true mystical beliefs, I suppose. So it's like this sort of stew pot of potential lies, and so half of the job of someone looking at them is to try and unstitch the reality from the and also, of course, because they're cellular rather than this top-down system, um, which is debatable. Obviously, the different Nexiums kind of produce their own content and their own takes on things. So again, you have to sort of figure out what's the source. It's very different. It's far more complicated than it feels a top-down system would be, if that makes any sense.
Right. Well, my problem with the ONA has always been that some people may be surprised by this, and I mentioned it before in some of our earlier conversations. I see the ONA thinking as a logical consequence of liberal thought, that anything goes, that we're the master of our own destiny, that, we're individualism, we can do whatever we want. In the same way, I would compare it to the Marquis de Sade, who was really an extreme liberal, who hated God, who hated religion, who hated monarchy, who hated authority. And so he believed, well, anything goes. I see the ONA to be part of that tradition. Also, I'm allergic to this kind of wishy-washiness of a refusal to take a stand on what you actually believe, and constantly. One of the most annoying things about the ONA to me is an ONA initiate, if you want to dignify them with that degree of honor. They will get involved with an Islamic terrorist group for a while to see what that's like, to present themselves as an Islamic terrorist. They'll present themselves as a Nazi. They'll present themselves as a radical Marxist. They will quite. This is something actually that the Process Church of the Final Judgment did to a certain extent. They would experiment. What would it be like to be part of this extreme group or that extreme group against, as you probably know, this phrase, the gray forces of just mediocrity and conformity. Actually, the Process Church was doing that on a smaller scale decades ago. And I have this, my problems with the ONA are very similar to the Process Church in its insincerity, its lack of in other words, there is an authentic truth. there is a reality. I don't accept the ONA or like extreme radical atheist belief that well, we all have different ideas. They could all be equally true. I don't think that is true whatsoever. I think there are absolute truths, particularly when it comes to metaphysical matters. So this whole wishy-washy going back and forth, I I mean, I've seen some of these people. They're sociopathic. They join various occult groups. They pretend to be sincerely interested. They think they're stealing the secrets from these groups and applying it to some grand, satanic agenda. And I don't buy it. I think its total lack of sincerity makes it ultimately meaningless. It just makes it like cosplay. Like, okay, this week I'm going to be that, next week I'll be this. I don't think there's any actual radical transgressive wisdom to be gained through that practice.
Do you think that there's some argument that it could also just be a honeypot for National Socialism as well?
Oh yeah, some people are using it as an agenda for pushing a kind of distorted idea of National Socialism. But David Maia even presented himself as a radical Islamist for a while. I don't take it serious. I mean, yes, it is seriously pathological and damaging, and of course they do encourage actual murder, self-harm. Let's not whitewash them in any way. It's not just an interesting philosophical group. It has led to criminal, abuse of people, sexual exploitation, encouraging suicide, encouraging killing of animals and pets,
Actual
encouraging
murder.
actual murder. So let's not whitewash them or think that they're just an interesting little transgressive edgelord philosophy. It is a genuinely, and when I say it's dangerous, I don't mean to romanticize it as evil. It's a noxious sociopathic behavior that has entered the occult stream. But is it really that different then it's just going a step further into pathology than people like L. Ron Hubbard or LaVey or Aquino? It's going a step beyond them. But I see it as mental illness, ultimately, mental illness and criminality. I refuse to dignify it as a credible spiritual system.
I want to talk about your own satanic kind of or demon worship, or your own practice, and how, because there's this misconception that you went straight from devil worship to tantric Buddhism, but actually it's a bit more complicated than that. And also, but prior to that, obviously the most recent sort of version of Satanism would be the Temple of Satan, I think they're called. It's the atheistic group. Have you had any dealings with them, and what are your thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I don't think there's an occult group in the world that I haven't encountered, and among my fans and people who are interested in my work, of course, there are people from all of those backgrounds. So I know some people from the Temple of Satan who are decent people who I personally like. But my problems with the Temple of Satan is that it is simply a reactionary political group. It should, again, like the Church of Satan didn't believe in Satan, then don't fucking call yourself the Church of Satan. Very simple. But become an atheist social Darwinist group. Why mess around with something that is a real being? The Temple of Satan too. That these people don't believe in a literal Satan or a devil. They don't even have any interest in that at all. It is simply a left wing. And again, I even use the phrase left wing loosely because I don't buy that these people are actually, left wing. But they are advocates of a kind of trendy wokeism, a reaction to Republican evangelical Christianity. And they're only, I mean, other than I think it's largely, again, like with LaVey, a publicity vehicle with no spiritual substance. It's just trying to piss off Christians by bringing Baphomet, into the American tradition of having the Ten Commandments or a figure of Jesus or some kind of Christian symbolism in government buildings. It's pushing the freedom of religion idea in America, like saying, oh, well, let's have satanic teaching at kindergartens. Let's have a statue of Baphomet at a government building. But it's juvenile, adolescent sophomoric. It has no genuine spiritual substance. It's basically just intended to get a rise out of evangelical Christian conservatives, who I don't like either, but it's just a pointless exercise in political symbolism. And one funny thing about it that I pointed out is the Temple of Satan, like a lot of people who think they're doing genuine Satanism, concentrate on this figure of Baphomet. And as I pointed out, Baphomet, most scholars believe, he's certainly not this androgynous, goat-headed, serpent-footed being that Eliphas Levi or Alphonse Constant. He just made a drawing, an illustration in his book, and that has somehow become seen as some genuine tradition. But like many of these things we're talking about, nobody ever really presented Baphomet in that way. I've seen a Baphomet in an Austrian chapel in a Castle Lockenhaus in Austria, where there's a Templar chapel, and it has a Baphomet on it. It's simply a circular shape with other intersecting circles within it. There's no connection to the devil, and part of that came from, as often happens in this phenomena, with the persecutors of the Knights Templar accused them of worshiping a devilish being named Baphomet. But the irony is, with the Temple of Satan and other so-called Satanists who use Baphomet, most scholars believe that what happened is the Knights Templar and other evangelical Christian groups that went to the Holy Land during the Crusades encountered Sufis and adopted some of their mystical practices, but because of the language barrier, mispronounced and misspelled Mahomet as Baphomet. So in other words, these Satanists are making statues and using the name and worshiping Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. So nothing could characterize the general ignorance of the occult world. It's like they're allergic to historical fact, and they would much prefer fantasy. And if you tell them that kind of thing, they're just too wedded to have too long a vested interest to drop these things. And I'm not going to get into it in this conversation because I've talked about it at depth. But if these Satanists looked at what the Satan is, they would understand that he is the lieutenant of Yahweh. He is a faithful subordinate to God. He is not his opponent. He is not his adversary. He's a very minor official in God's court who comes to earth to tempt people, to check. He even came to earth to test Jesus, to see if Jesus really was committed. So, the whole thing is based on mistranslation, misunderstanding, and ignorance. But I think the Temple of Satan's usage of Baphomet as being, here's the authentic occult tradition, is like one of the most ludicrous examples of what I call a little knowledge is a dangerous thing phenomenon. But these people aren't interested in historical fact any more than QAnon and Trump supporters are. They are interested in what makes them feel good emotionally, what will piss off their enemies. They have merely emotional reasons to believe what they believe. They don't care if these things are true. So I've learned there's no point in even arguing with them. I mean, you and I can discuss what is true and what's not true, but we live in a post-truth world where people believe what they want to believe, and they can cherry pick from their own little bubble of algorithms, their own little universe where the flat earth is proven, where NASA didn't go to the moon, where Trump is saving children from a satanic cabal of adrenochrome drinking elites. We live in a very dangerous world where a kind of mass schizophrenia is forming, where people live in their own insanities that have nothing to do with historical reality. And I think that's at the core of inauthenticity with spiritual practice.
I didn't ask you this last time, but I'll be interested in your take on it. Did you see the video? Well, yeah, it was a video that came out of Tucker Carlson interviewing some kind of Hollywood type. And
Yeah.
it's like an hour long kind of diatribe about how occultism's everywhere in
Yeah.
Hollywood. And
Well, to put this in context, I mean, as a casualty of the satanic panic under the Reagan-Bush regime in the 80s, I have watched the Trump administration from the very beginning and seen the kind of people that support it, the influencers and various grotesque personalities that idolize Trump, or even if they admit they hate him, like Tucker Carlson admitted that he hated him and was hoping he never has to hear about him again. But he knows what side of the bread is buttered on, so now he continues to kiss his ass. Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk, these people definitely had an agenda to demonize occultism in the same way that was happening in the 80s. And it's clearly, to me, as someone who experienced it, a continuation of that whole belief. And I'm very often, blamed by these very kinds of people and their supporters as being a member of the Illuminati. They think any musician has signed their soul to the devil. They think anyone who's involved with any kind of creative or artistic pursuit must, by the very nature of that activity, be a devil worshiper. Even if they know I'm a Buddhist, they think Buddhism is the evil, unchristian cult. So you can't win with these people. But yeah, I'm very aware also of your, I'm sure you're proud of him, your countryman Russell Brand, now making himself into a Christian to avoid obviously he's doing it like a prisoner in prison who says, oh, I found Christ now, because he'd been accused of these sexual harassment charges. He dipped into this very superficial Christianity. And, he too is praying with Tucker Carlson against satanic forces that are threatening the sainted, stable genius, President Trump. So yeah, I'm very aware of it. I would say that group of people are more dangerous on a higher level than even the ONA. I think that this is an extremely malevolent force in history. This kind of TV pundit, like people looking at Charlie Kirk as a real debater and philosopher and thinker. People like Jordan Peterson, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. These are very mediocre minds who are just using the most crude propaganda. But they are having a very deleterious effect on humanity. So
they certainly feel like they feel more like staged puppet. I know you saw the same video because I saw you liked it on Instagram of I've forgotten the lady's name now already. I literally posted a video of her earlier on, but she's talking about how like one of the tricks of the right was to sort of present its main forces as idiots, and actually that there's some very, very clever minds in the background working. And it feels like this is a symptom of those clever minds rather than and also another thing that's interesting, I think with the last satanic panic, the left still had they still pushed back against it, didn't they, a lot more.
For instance, even though there were left-wing people who did not like the Werewolf Order, my organization, or me, or Radio Werewolf, they did defend me because you're supposedly supposed to have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. They may have done it, holding their nose because they didn't like what I represented, but they did stick to their principles of saying, well, if you have freedom of religion and freedom of speech, he's allowed to do and say what he's doing if he's not harming anyone. That's not happening anymore because, interestingly, the woke left also kind of has similar conspiratorial ideas, So, yeah, there is no.
It feels like they're too busy attacking themselves a lot of the time than
Well,
looking at this giant problem over there.
Right. The extreme right and the extreme left have always spent more time killing each other than actually addressing their enemies, like Trotskyites and Marxists still fighting in 2025 over that. Or, the classic, well, look at how quickly Musk and Trump turned on each other, even less time than Hitler and Rome. So, extreme political ideologies always lead to internal dissension and accusations of heresy and attempts to create a purity of authority, they're bound to spend more time fighting with each other than actually achieving their goals.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
Also,
Trump
I think
is a
one
very
thing that's worth mentioning is the other thing is that the right have captured media now as well, whereas before media always felt far more controlled by
leftist.
the left. Yeah, or at
Well,
least liberal.
one of their weird folklore tricks is to say the media, as if the media is only liberal.
Mm.
But Rupert Murdoch owns Fox News. It's not like
Mm.
some underground pirate station. This MAGA pseudo right, this Christian evangelical pseudo right, is the mainstream now. It is the establishment, but they're very cleverly pretend to be the plucky little outsider fighting
Mhm.
against the liberal elites. But Rupert Murdoch is not an outsider. Donald
No,
Trump, a billionaire from the real estate world, is not an outsider and has never been. So
no.
that's one of the many lies of the populist modern right, that it is a transgressive outsider movement. You know that
Mm.
they're and it isn't. You know that Fox News is as mainstream as you could get, but they
Mhm.
still pretend that they're some kind of radical.
Yeah,
So,
it's infuriating.
but the implications for practitioners in the United States of magic and occultism or any kind of alternative religion, including Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, anything that is not, or Catholicism for that matter, anything that is not this Charlie Kirk version of evangelical, this politicized evangelical Christianity, this office of faith that the White House has formed, they definitely do want to create a evangelical theocracy. And I'm astonished when I see Western occultists support Trump or any
Mm.
aspect of MAGA and not see that this is a existential threat to their freedom.
Yeah, we were talking about this on the Mo Zone that we recorded yesterday. It's like I don't see the point or the end goal. There's some I won't name and shame because we didn't in the Move Zone, but there are podcasters that are quite big in the kind of occult space, I suppose, and YouTubers that are clearly very supportive of Trump, or at least sort of dog whistle a kind of support
Right,
to Trump.
right.
But I don't see the end goal. Where's the end goal? You know, like surely it's like I think I said it in the Mozone episode. It's this often these kind of radical supporters or these kind of fringe supporters are the first ones to go. You know, the first ones up against the wall, aren't they? I mean, what do
Uh,
they? Yeah, what do they expect to
no,
happen?
I believe that as this becomes more malevolent, these occultists who think that there is some way to make sense of occultism in MAGA are going to have a very rude awakening when they,
Hmm.
and I think they're starting to see that with this interview you talked about with Tucker Carlson.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're fools. Not that I approve in any way of the establishment so-called left, which to me the American left, there is no functioning left wing in the United States. There is
Mm.
no force that actually supports the working class in the traditional sense of what left wing politics means. There's a lot of social issues about issues that really are not either left or right, about ecology, about trans rights, but that is not the traditional meaning of the left any
Mm.
more that this hyper capitalist Zionism of Trump is not the right. So these words have mutated into something that almost mean nothing.
Mm.
But I
Yeah.
think
I think
in
the
terms
left
of
and right paradigm is certainly it feels like a dated term now, doesn't it, to describe what we're talking about? I think it's
well,
um
I mean, I think it's important. It's similarly as the left and right hand path are totally misunderstood.
mm,
As historians understand, left and right have no other context outside of the French Revolution. These phrases never were used before, literally came from Republicans, again, a word that has been misunderstood. Republicans who supported in France the king and the monarchy sat on the right of the king, and those who were supporting the revolution and who were against the monarchy sat on the left. So only when a political system is in disarray, when there is no real authority, do these terms left and right make any sense. But at this point, the radical right of the 1970s and 80s would never have recognized Donald Trump as their figurehead. Nothing. I mean, they were pro-ecology, anti-Christian, had socialist economic ideas. In fact, almost the total opposite of MAGA. So it's really mutated so weirdly. And I think it's part of the Kali Yuga, this etymological confusion where even words and definitions are used so wrongly, and it fosters confusion and ideological. It starts to become meaningless,
Yeah, I guess so. The so let's look briefly at your own kind of practice when you were a devil worshipper.
Right.
What what was a kind of, what was your practice? I suppose were there regular kind of things that you would
Right.
do, like rituals?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in from the very beginning of my life, I was first attracted to the Hellenic pantheon through the goddess Aphrodite, and then I also became fascinated with the northern myths, and I immediately felt an affinity with the Greek and Nordic pantheon and the Egyptian pantheon, all about equally in my early stage of life. And as I've told this story before, through a babysitter who identified herself as a witch long before the whole Wiccan revival really caught on, she introduced me to the figure of the devil. And to make a long story short, I studied the Bible to understand, well, what was the devil? I looked at the source. And like in Tantric Buddhism, I'm very much by the book. When I was a devil worshiper, I really sought out the ancient grimoires. I sought out what I could determine to be authentic diabolical practices. Now I understand in retrospect, none of them are authentic, actually. There's no such thing. And I'm the first to admit I was ignorant, I was fooled. It's very easy to be. And that is the nature of the devil. He fools you. He is a real being and he tries to fool you. So I looked at the ancient grimoires. I did the rituals all by the book. I had an altar, a shrine. I was very religious about my devil worship as I continued to be in worshiping Kali when I was involved with the Vedic Shaktiite left-hand path or Vamamarga, and as I am to this day with my devotions to Set, which are in the traditional Egyptian sense, and my Tantric Buddhist practice. So I was very much by the book. What I followed the ancient grimoires. I looked at the Faustian tradition of Mephistopheles a great deal. I studied as much as I possibly could in scholarly and less reliable sources. Everything. I was fascinated with the figure of the devil. I was not interested in the figures who are involved with it, the personalities involved with the history of Satanism, but the actual figure and persona of the devil. And I have encountered the devil 2 times in visible appearance and a third time in another method, which, as I've said, is not a very good track record for a devoted devil worshiper, only twice. But they absolutely showed me and convinced me this is a genuine being. But I ultimately understood and learned it is not what Christians and Satanists think it is. It is something other. And that's why eventually, why I'm no longer a devil worshiper. Once I understood through my practice and research what this being was, I had absolutely no interest in it because it is a lieutenant, a servant of Yahweh. And as a Gnostic, I believe Yahweh is the demiurge, is the Aldebaoth, is a totally malevolent God. So Satanists who are paying lip service to the devil are actually idolizing a being who is a very low lieutenant to Yahweh. So what sense does that make?
How did
Furthermore,
you do you ever
yeah,
I don't know if you've ever spoken to your experiences meeting the devil before. Um,
yeah, I have spoken about it a little, and in a memoir that I'm writing about my fate devil worshipping phase, I get into it in great detail. Yeah.
are
Uh,
you able to give us a a snippet
Oh yeah,
or?
yeah. It's not a secret. I've spoken
Mm,
about it. I did a invocation to the devil, and I was about I'm not sure 19 or 20, and I was very much working with the Goetia. Never self-invented rituals. I was always doing exactly by the book, the ceremonial magic. Um, and I was doing a lot of it very intensely. And after I was done one day doing it, for some reason, my attention was caught by a mirror in a hallway of the apartment I was in. And in the mirror behind me, I saw a beautiful woman, a very unearthly, uncanny looking, beautiful woman with long red hair, very ethereal, not human, with burning eyes, not grotesque or grisly in any way, beautiful but not of this earth, you know. And she was singing a very sweet melody, which unfortunately I cannot remember. I wish I could remember it. And she was singing the words, the lyrics to it, where the devil must be paid his due, over and over again. And I knew that this was a apparition, a manifestation of how the devil would appear to me. And I understood instinctively that the devil appears as you need it to appear. It has no ultimate form. It would appear to you in the form that would tempt you. So my 19 or 20-year-old self would certainly attention, this unearthly, seductive, beautiful woman would get my attention. But I knew this is not the devil. This is not, there is no essential form. This is the outer form that the Satan or the devil takes. And it was life changing in that I had no doubt at that point this thing exists. When I turned around to look at it, it was not there. It only manifested in the mirror.
Yeah, and you said there was a second time as well.
Right. The second time was the New Year's of 1985 going into 1986 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I did a very elaborate goetic sex magical ritual with some companions, and we all experienced the presence of the devil in the most dramatic. If it was in a horror movie, what happened, it would seem too cliched. A storm, we invoked the devil. A storm broke out immediately. The dog of the one of the couple's father, who was on the premises, died that night. Just suddenly died. They had to bury him. Everyone involved with the ritual, except me and one other woman, died because of it. And it was a goetic invocation of the devil, a very elaborate one that went on for hours. Um, and it made me. It was so. I believe that I actually was possessed at that point and remained possessed by some goetic force for some time. And it made me no longer want to deal with the goetia. It was so powerful and negative. It was even though I remained a devil worshiper, it was the beginning of my thinking this is destructive. This is it gives you power, but it is ultimately harmful. And
Yeah,
it
I
did give.
know Crowley was warned against the Goetia, wasn't he, by Bennett? I
Yeah,
believe it was during his time.
there's a famous anecdote at the Golden Dawn where Bennett met Crowley for the first time and said, "You've been messing with the Goetia, haven't you, little brother?"
Yeah.
And eventually, interestingly, Bennett became a Buddhist monk and introduced Theravada or Hinayana Buddhism to Britain and formed the Buddhist Society. And with the smattering of what little bit Crowley knew about Buddhism came from Alan Bennett.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So,
So,
would
so
you say that
there was a third version was a dream, which I can tell the difference between a dream that is just a regurgitation of unconscious things going on in your mind. So I don't consider this a evocation to visible appearance as the other two were. I was in a mall, a very ugly utilitarian looking shopping mall, empty shopping mall in Trona, which is near Death Valley on the way to the desert where I used to go. And I had a dream there that the devil appeared as just an ordinary, overweight, normal American that you would meet out in the desert in a rural town. And at that point, I was already moving away from devil worship and looking into other forms, which I always did. I do have to point out that despite my devil worship, I always was practicing other spiritual methods, including Zen Buddhism. I looked into Sufism, Gnosticism. I never was 100% only a devil worshiper. You know, I also followed Egyptian and Nordic religion. So, you know, it's not like I was a monomaniac, only interested in the devil. But at this point, I was starting to become skeptical about the devil and very much moving away from Satanism and occultism. It was in the late 90s in Los Angeles when I had this. And Trona is a very barren desert place that could remind you of where Satan appeared to tempt Jesus and the devil. So couldn't have been a more ordinary, mediocre looking person, not looking like the devil in any way. And he approached me in the dream in this mall and aggressively and angrily said to me, "Look, I've done so much for you. Look what an ingrate you're being. You know, think of all the things I've done for you." He was trying to convince me, don't abandon him, and angrily, you know, saying, "Look, you've used my name, you've used my power. Look at all the things I've given you in your life," which is true to a certain extent. That is true. And I defied him, and I said, "I'm not in an angry way. I just said I'm not interested in a matter of fact way." And that was the beginning of my total abandonment of Satanism. Not, it didn't completely happen immediately, but I believe that that was a true metaphysical event that occurred on the spiritual plane in a dream. Sometimes dreams are real. Sometimes dreams in the dream Bardo, spiritual beings can appear and you can have a conversation with them. And I'm pretty sure that's what happened there.
Yeah, I'm
So
a
that,
big believer in dreams. That the type of dream you're talking about, I've
I
experienced
mean, some
similar
dreams
dreams.
are clearly just our mind is
Mhm.
reintegrating experiences we've had, and I recognize them as such. I see, okay, this is a dream because of Bob, and so I'm dreaming this. This was clearly a visitation from that being.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So,
All three times he appeared or it appeared as a being, never with a consistent form.
mm. So the what where how did you land on tantric Buddhism then?
Well, the fact is, I always had an interest in Tibetan Buddhism from my earliest study of any spiritual traditions. And I knew a great deal about it. I had read it, a lot about it. It's just that I didn't, when, like the first spiritual practice that I actually did, other than doing magical rituals from my childhood into my teens, was I learned meditation from an Advaita teacher, a young hippie who had gone to India, and she learned meditation and she taught it to me when I was 13 years old. So I've been using Eastern methods of mysticism and meditation all my life. Uh, a few years later, I went to a Zen center in Los Angeles and learned from a Roshi who had learned from a very well-known San Francisco Roshi. So I learned Zen meditation. I learned Advaita meditation. And however, I misused it. I used the practice of Zen Buddhism to be a more efficient, more aware, more awake occultist. I did not accept Buddhism at that point. I didn't accept its ethics. I didn't accept karma. I didn't accept its basic teachings, but I did learn the method. So it's not like I was unfamiliar with Tantric Buddhism and Buddhism itself. Then when I had this sort of crisis of faith in the 90s, when the Temple of Set was like the ultimate last nail in the coffin of my interest in Satanism or occultism at all, I sought deliberately, like, okay, I'm done with these do-it-yourself alternative religions that were invented last Tuesday by somebody for some agenda. And I turned instead to, very much like Rene Guénon and the traditionalist idea that to reject counter initiation and to seek genuine initiation that can be proven by a track record going back thousands of years. So I already practiced the worship of Set, but that is somewhat limited in that we know a great deal about the traditional worship of Set from how many Egyptian records are kept, but we don't know all of it. You know, we don't have a literal living tradition of a lineage that goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. I basically accept the principles of Gnosticism, but that lineage too is a dead lineage. It's alive in our heart in the sense that the kingdom of heaven is within you, but there is no Gnostic teacher who can say exactly what Basilides taught. You know, all those, it's a tradition that died out, so we can only study it and kind of speculate. Even though one of my mentors is Dr. Stephan Heller of the Ecclesia Gnostica. So I couldn't say that Gnosticism or the ancient Egyptian religion could be the ultimate tradition because too much of it is unknown. We don't have a living tradition of it. So I looked at Sufism very seriously, the esoteric form of Islam. I studied under a sheikh. I found a great deal of wisdom in Sufism, but ultimately I could not accept aspects of Islam, like for instance, the way that women are treated was untenable to me. Slaughtering animals. Have been a vegetarian and then a vegan for most of my life. I would never kill any animal under any conditions. I couldn't accept the monotheism because I have no doubt there are many gods. There's not just one God. So I found wisdom in Sufism and many parallels with Tantric Buddhism, actually. There's many sort of culturally different ways of practicing the same thing within the actual practice. And ultimately, and most of my spiritual practice is connected to theurgy and I am not anthropocentric in my spiritual discipline. I'm very much a devotee of the gods, of the divine. And I was doing a Vamamarga meditation that I learned years ago, focusing on Kali from the Shaktiite perspective. And I had already had an insight that the gods, I mean, ultimately, the point of Shaktiite religion of the left-hand path is by venerating the feminine through Kali or another Shakti, that you unite your mind, your consciousness becomes united with the divine, with her. And I had an insight around that time that there is a higher level than the gods, that the divine realm is also still within the world of suffering and all the transient dramas that humans experience. I just had a kind of insight and intuition. And this was in my bedroom in Berlin, totally, you know, not a temple or anything, and not, it was just in the afternoon. I was meditating about Kali, and she appeared to me, a visible appearance with my eyes open, as a matronly Indian middle-aged woman that you could see walking on the streets of London any day. Motherly, kind, not with fangs and her tongue sticking out or dark skin, you know, just looked like a ordinary Indian woman, but and appeared a materialization, a vision in my bedroom. And she spoke to me and said very simply, I knew it was Kali. I knew it was Kali Ma. And she said, you should become a Buddhist to correct something in your abdomen chakra specifically. That's it. And you get a divine order from Kali, then you do it. At least I do. And I took it very seriously. It was a very moving, mystical experience. And by coincidence, there was a Sri Lankese monk who lived down the street. I'd seen him and had, you know, nodded to him, or we had some friendly contact. I remembered he lived right down the street. So the next day I went there, rang his doorbell, talked to him about my experience. And he is from Sri Lanka, or what was formerly Ceylon, and that is a half Hindu, half Buddhist country. So rather than being shocked by Kali telling me to become a Buddhist, he said, oh, yeah, that makes sense, because in Ceylon, we believe that Kali has become liberated and has become a Buddhist. So that's how I entered the stream of Buddhism. But I was already familiar with it, but basically Kali told me to become one, and I did.
It's interesting you
Um,
say that, because I had a, I think I've spoken about this on the other podcast, but I had an experience. We were, well, I was looking into the thing called the gateway experience, which is a kind of binaural system to activate out of body experience. I was playing around with the that you can get these kind of, well, they used to be cassettes, and now you can,
right,
you know, download digital files and you listen to them, and they trigger a kind of some kind of astral experience.
right,
Um, and I was talking about it a while back on the same show, and then one of our listeners, who's I promised not to say who he works for, but he works for within audio engineering for a very big broadcaster, and he said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. I've been playing around with creating my own uh, version of the gateway experience. You know, just trying to kind of see if, you know, using more complex kind of binaural kind of signals and stuff." And so he said, "Can I send some to you?" And I said, "Yeah, great." And they sounded, I don't know if you've ever heard the guy Merzbow before from Japan.
oh
It's
yeah, yeah,
these
sure.
horrible, or White House or something like that. It was real intense static kind
Yeah,
of sound.
industrial noise, of course. Yes, I'm
Yeah.
familiar.
So there was like 6 files, and I went through the first 5, and I thought, God, these are just giving me a migraine. They're really very long files, as you know, you have to lie there, and on the 6th one, I was like, oh God, it's just more of the same. And I remember all of a sudden I just went into this strange, like, I can't really explain it, like this sort of almost rapturous state. And
Mhm.
this face, I started to see everything as like, you know, TV, old fashioned TV static, where it's like,
Right,
I started to see
snow.
it. Yeah, like this was like snow, but in real, you know, in front of me and surrounding me. And then
I've had
this,
that experience too. I know exactly what you mean. Yep.
yeah, this sort of face pushed through, and it said, because at the time, I should contextualize this slightly. I was doing a thing called the keto diet, which is very meat heavy. And prior to that, I'd been eating meat for a while, but prior to that, I was a vegetarian myself for a very long time.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, anyway, this face pushes through. It said, and it just says to me really clearly, it said, "I am Krishna. From this point on, you will never eat meat again. Any attempt to eat meat will cause illness." It's basically what it
Right,
said. And
right,
so I was like, oh, "Okay, that was really strange." And then it just pushed back out, and then the TV static kind of cleared. And
right,
I went to the kitchen because I actually had a meal prepared, and it was meat. It was a steak. I tried eating it, and then almost within seconds, I had to run to the bathroom and projectile vomited into into the toilet. And yeah, ever since then, I've gone back to vegetarianism. I'm not messing with Krishna. So
right.
you know, yeah, it's
Well,
like a
I think it's great that you have that experience too. I
mm,
mean, people who doubt that the gods are there, that they
mm,
communicate to us, and that they have our best interests at heart. They want to help us, despite our stupid human mortal stumbling around blindly. The gods intervene, and that's why
mm.
it's a very important part of my spiritual life is contact with the gods. So that I think that shows you that Krishna and Kali, coming from the same pantheon and
Mm.
tradition, both of them had concerns for us, health concerns. Like Kali's concern was that I fix whatever was wrong with my abdomen chakra. Krishna's concern was that you should stop eating meat.
Yeah, and it's weird.
So,
It's changed my whole philosophy. I think before I used to be a vegetarian just because I felt like it was the right thing to do, and now it feels more like an inbuilt imperative. Now I
right,
cannot eat meat now, and and not just because I was told not to, but it's
right,
actually ingrained in me now. Like I will never eat meat again, and that includes
right,
fish, because I used to be kind of pescatarian a lot of the time. But the idea
right.
of having anything that once lived inside me is it feels
Well,
impure
now,
almost.
now these two experiences we're describing, I think, are very good illustrations. Take all the mumbo jumbo and complicated rituals and procedures of Western occultism. Very rarely do they lead to this direct connection
Mm,
to the Godhead, to divinity. once you've had, I think once you've had these experiences, I mean, even when I was younger and I had my encounter with the devil, I wasn't interested in Satanism. I was interested in this figure.
Mm.
Uh, I think once you've had real mystical experiences and contact with the divine, these occult groups of human beings seem very silly and beside the point. You know, you don't have to explain why. You have an encounter with a superior being from the diva loca, or the divine realm. It changes your whole perspective on human life.
Mm. Yeah,
So
no, it certainly did. I mean, it was, yeah, for me personally, it was quite a change agent in general. It wasn't just the vegetarianism; it kind of
right,
flipped my perspective quite a lot. And it, I've had mystical experiences via magic. Weirdly, though, via magic or from through Crowley's system, at least. The one
right,
experience, like big experience I had, was just from doing the lesser banishing ritual because I used to have a much bigger thelemic practice, but actually in the end it just came down to doing the LBRP for a while. And actually
mhm,
when I was really focused in, locked in on just doing that every morning,
right,
that's when I had that triggered a mystical experience. Something that basic triggered this mystical experience. So it was yeah, it's strange. It feels like sometimes the overcomplicated stuff, it feels almost like you're performing somebody else's ego, if that makes sense. So
exactly. No,
mm,
the real mystical experience wakes you up and shows you the
mhm,
world is not what we think it is in an incredibly vivid and undeniable way. And until you've had that experience, you're sort of playing house with occultism.
mm,
Now, an interesting point about what you're saying, that you just did one simple practice every day.
mhm,
I see with my students and with many people who claim to practice magic or some mystical tradition, they think about it, they read about it, they consider themselves interested in it, but they very rarely, except with the very best and most disciplined and diligent people, do they actually have a daily practice that they
mm,
do with great diligence. If you did any spiritual practice with great diligence every day, you will get results.
mhm.
If all you do is just keep thinking about this stuff and reading it and studying it and musing over it, you know, that's like it's like watching a travelogue instead of going to the place you're traveling to.
Mm, yeah, and I think that the occult world's certainly littered with that type of person, isn't it? It's there's I mean, I'm sure it's fine to be interested and to have a reading interest, but I
Sure.
don't think you can. I don't think you can call yourself an occultist just because you've read about it. I
No.
think you have to
Look
have
at
experienced it.
look at how many people in the occult world spend a fortune on these beautifully made deluxe edition, limited edition occult books. Maybe they don't even read them, but they put them on a shelf and they call themselves a magician, but they never. I'm amazed by how few so-called magicians do magic.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, they think about it. But I mean, if you actually people, it's so simple. Try to communicate with a particular god, form a relationship with these
Hmm.
gods exist. They are immensely more powerful and wise than we are, and they will help us, some of them.
Hmm.
Uh, it's you just try to communicate with them on a daily basis, and eventually they will contact you and they will give you wisdom that we as humans do not have. And
Mm.
that's a big part of it, is many modern humans cannot accept that there are greater powers, that our little ego is not the full extent of the world, and that we have a very limited perspective compared to the divine realm. So
Mm.
yeah, I'm glad that you brought those things up, because
Mm.
I mean, doing a simple pranayama ritual every day would change your life. And then the
Mhm.
more you add to it, the more you add tried and true practices, not something that was just invented for novelty's sake.
Mm.
You know,
And pranayama is a very simple one to do as well, which is well, simple in the execution, I suppose.
right.
Obviously, it takes
But it
some.
has, yeah, it has profound changes that if you do it every day, the problem is a lot of people get bored easily. Well, I did this practice and nothing happened. You have to
Mm.
keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it until it becomes part of your DNA, and then you have tremendous changes.
No,
Or
one good
even
bit of
people
it.
doing magic to do a ritual to make something happen. They'll do it once and say, "Oh, nothing happened." Well, it's not that easy to change. to change material reality requires a certain amount of mastery of the spiritual world and of your own mind.
One good bit of advice I got when I joined the ATO was learn the LBRP so well that you can do it in your sleep. And for Thelemites especially, that becomes quite a useful thing to have available to you in your sleep at certain points.
How many so-called Thelemites just read everything they can read about the life of Aleister Crowley, and they're not.
I was amazed. I was amazed when I joined the ATO how few actual members of the ATO I encountered actually performed any magic at all. It was a social
Right.
club.
I mean, I'm no great admirer of Crowley, but are they writing poetry? Are they climbing mountains? Are they having 10,000 mistresses and traveling the world? And, you know,
well, I'd say some of them, I'd say a percentage of them were genuine magicians, but and they're the ones actually, ironically, that I've remained friends with. But I mean, I think for some people, I think a lot of these magical orders, I think we've spoken about this before, present a opportunity for certain people to have access to a friend group that they couldn't otherwise get.
right.
Yeah, and because you're bound to them through fraternity, you kind of have to put up with some.
Right.
This is one of the reasons I left in the end, because the filter of membership was becoming very problematic. Let's say.
Right. No, I mean,
Yeah.
I think if you have a busy life, and I mean, I know what I'm doing with my life as a musician, as a writer, as a filmmaker. I have work, I have friends, I have a life. I don't need to join a group to meet people. And I think people kid themselves a lot. They're lonely and they're looking for some sort of fraternal group. And then they sort of go along with the spiritual ideas in a lip service way, just to hang around the people, but just to have animal warmth, which is an understandable human need, but it is not a reason to become involved in a spiritual tradition, which ultimately initiation happens within us alone in solitude. It helps to have other like-minded people who are doing the practice, or even people who have another spiritual practice but are sincere. But just hanging around a group, it's just another subculture. It's not going to lead to true initiatory wisdom.
Now, talking
And
of true initiatory wisdom in this modern world, you have a book, don't you, that's available now that kind of is a guidebook for people that want to navigate this kind of chaos we're in now.
Right. Well,
Spiritually.
in the past couple of years, particularly since 2020, something I've been harping on, I believe that the Kali Yuga has gone into a much deeper phase than it ever has before. All of the things that Eastern religions have predicted, both Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, about the Kali Yuga are occurring. And I realized through my own students, through my own practice, and through dealing with other spiritual teachers who've encountered similar phenomena, the things have fallen apart so drastically that it is necessary to have a much more urgent approach to your initiation. It's like the house is burning down. You don't have time to speculate and to experiment and to try out. You know, civilization is literally collapsing. The foundations of society are almost gone. Culture is decadent and falling apart. On every basis, you know, all the pillars of civilized life are crumbling very quickly. The standards are lowering. So this is a book. It's called The 108 Laws of Initiation, Spiritual Mastery in the Kali Yuga. It's 108 laws that I have learned from teaching, from my own life, and from dealing with my own many students around the world. How do you make an effective, pragmatic form of initiation, no matter what spiritual tradition you are in? Could be any. How do you apply the emergency measures required for the Kali Yuga? I saw that this is absolutely necessary. I mean, because ancient practitioners didn't have to deal with things like this social media and its incredibly toxic effect on the human mind. The way that human beings relate to each other is worsening and declining drastically. And these things are not really addressed. I mean, of course, there are universal truths in all the ancient spiritual traditions, but there needed to be a book that addresses how do we deal with the crisis of what we are living through right now. And that's what the book offers, not in a airy or ethereal or philosophical way, very pragmatic. What should you do? What should you not do? Like, you know, if the plane crashes, the stewardess tells you, here's what you need to do. It's not theoretical. The theoretical age is over. You know, we have to concentrate on our spiritual practice now because things are falling apart too quickly. It's the only thing that is of essence or important. So yeah, that's the nature of the book, and it's available only through if you write to my assistant at Schreckworks, SCHRECWORX @gmail.com, you can be informed on how to purchase it.
And knowing you probably have a million other projects coming out, but are there any more recent? Are there more anything? Is there anything recent that we can promote?
Well, yeah, since the last interview we did a few years ago about my book, The Satanic Screen, in 2024, Head Press Books put out a beautiful hardcover new edition of it with many, I've revised it, expanded it, and made it into the ultimate version of the Satanic Screen. And it has a long introduction explaining exactly what the devil is, which I realized was needed. So that's a very deep study of who and what this Satan or the devil actually is and what it's not. And it updates from my book that came out in 2000 and gets into the satanic cinema. Since then, adds a lot more information about some of the films that I've learned in later research. The Manson File, which has been plagued with problems since the beginning of its existence in 1988 and now has gone through 3 different editions. That was published in England in a final edition, and it's sold out completely, but a new edition will be available through Cargo, which you can find on my social media page as a link to Cargo.
And my former bandmate is helping you.
Right.
Luke Younger is helping you get that out there, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. So that was last year. When I was in England last week, I signed a contract for a new book from Head Press, which will be about my friendship and working relationship with Christopher Lee, and particularly the things that he told me and that I then later researched about his love-hate relationship with the character of Dracula and the vampire. Stuff that he'd never talked about before that I learned in the process of collaborating with him on a script we were doing about Sir Henry Irving, who was Bram Stoker's prototype. So that's one. And there are several other books that are coming out, one on Abraxas, several that I'm not going to really describe, better that you read them when they come out. When I was in England, I recorded a new song that will come out in January. I've been working on an album that is kind of the next step in my musical evolution after the trilogy of albums I released from 2019 to 2021. This is sort of a new phase. And just last night, I sort of gave a preview of it. I did a Halloween concert here in Berlin, which moving into a more neoclassical direction in my music and a less electric and more acoustic classical direction. So yeah, I'm making a documentary film that will be edited in London. So you were right when you said 1 million. It's nearly $1 million.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your patience as well for doing a redo with us here. And I actually think this has actually turned out better than the original recording that we had.
So
And,
practice makes perfect. And one of the things that one of my teachers, Ayang Rinpoche, said to me that patience is probably the most important spiritual quality to develop. That patience is the sort of bulwark and fortress against the disturbing emotion. So, so our first attempt at recording it was fucked up by some audio issue. We could get angry about it, or we can just efficiently move on and do a better version of it. So that too is a spiritual virtue. Patience is something that we all need to develop.
Yeah, excellent. But thank you so much for more of your time, and I look forward to you coming on again. I always look forward to you coming on the show. So
Okay.
yeah,
Next time in England, we'll try to do it live, which we kept trying to do, and eventually we will succeed.
yeah, we will finally get there.
So on the Day of the Dead, which this is, or in the future, when people watch this, after we have joined the dead, I send many blessings to your watchers and to you, and that you attain swiftly the means and causes and conditions for liberation from suffering for all sentient beings.